What is this? Well, today we're going to be talking a little bit about what is commonly referred to as the afterlife, and how, the Egyptian culture versus, what does the Bible say? So, let's talk about that. So it's important to remember, we've been talking about Joseph, and the whole idea of the account of Joseph is really, how did the people of Israel get to Egypt? So that's where we are. We're in Egypt now. So the ancient Egyptians, they had this belief that a person had two souls or spirits. One of them they called the Ba, and one of them they called the Ka. And they believed that these souls or spirits, that they lived on after death. And one of those spirits, the Ka, it could leave the physical body and it could travel freely about in the whole spiritual world. However, at nighttime, this Ka would have to return to its physical body in this world. So unless the body looked like it did during life, the spirit would get confused. It wouldn't recognize the body, and then it would get lost. And so they felt like the person's body needed to be preserved so that it would look as lifelike as possible even after its death. So to further help this whole spirit of the Ka recognize its physical body, many times the Egyptians would make mummies that had these lifelike masks, and even their coffins sometimes would have faces painted on them. You've probably seen things that look like this. Anytime you've heard about mummies or anything of that sort in the Egyptians. So ask yourself this question: how long has Joseph been in Egypt? And then specifically in Pharaoh's house. It's been quite a while. We know that he's been at least 20 years in Egypt. He was 17 whenever he was sold, and he was 30 when he entered Pharaoh's service, based on Scripture. So that means he's been there for 13 years just in Egypt. And then when he was 30, he entered Pharaoh's service. 7 years of plenty. He was there with Pharaoh. So at least 20 years he was in Egypt before his family came. And as you think about that, I bet that Joseph was very familiar with the beliefs of the Egyptians in the afterlife, and he probably was familiar with this whole mummification process and how all that worked. So I suspect that he knew exactly what that was, particularly as years went by and he got older. So now, we know that this whole process, it takes time. But remember, how old was Jacob, not Joseph, Jacob, whenever he came to Egypt? Because he was old enough to have had 12 sons already, and he was old enough that one of his youngest sons was now well into his 30s. He was almost 40 years old. So how old was Jacob? Fortunately, we know the answer to that question. Genesis chapter 47 actually gives us the answer to that question. 47 verse 8 and 9. Pharaoh asks Jacob, "How old are you?" Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Interesting. He says they've been few, but he's 130 years old. I don't know anybody that's even 100 years old, at least that I know of. I have met one person that I remember lived to be 105, but I don't remember anybody else. And he says, my years have been few and difficult. So Jacob actually lived another 17 years. Chapter 47, verse 28, it says, Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life are 147. It's quite a good long while. So we know that he was old. We know that he lived to be 147, and that eventually he died in the land of Egypt. Now, listen to this. We've been talking about this whole idea of the mummification process and the fact that they would preserve the physical body. But listen to this. This is Genesis chapter 49, starting in verse 33. So, when Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into his bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. In other words, he actually died here. Chapter 50. Joseph threw himself on his father, and he wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming. And the Egyptians mourned for him for 70 days. Does it sound to you like maybe the Egyptians turned Jacob into a mummy? It kind of does to me. Now, even though the family of Jacob, Israel, didn't believe the same as the Egyptians, and they certainly didn't believe in the whole split spirit, the Ba and the Ka, and all of those things, I don't think that was the case at all. My Bible class buddy. Joseph was wealthy. He was the second in command over all the land of Egypt. He was powerful, and therefore his father was an important figure in the country just because his son was so important. So they did the whole embalming procedure for 40 days that was reserved only for the wealthy and the important or the powerful, and even, you might say, for royalty. So let me ask you this. Knowing that they didn't believe the same, why do you think they mummified or embalmed Jacob? Do you have any ideas? Well, fortunately, I think we actually get an answer to that question in the scripture. This is Genesis chapter 50, starting in verse 4. When the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, "If I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him, my father made me swear an oath and said, I am about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go up and bury my father, then I will return." Verse 6, Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father as he made you swear to do." So Joseph went up to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court, and all the dignitaries of Egypt. It was a whole bunch of people. They even had chariots and horsemen. They went up. It was a very large company. So they took the body of Jacob back to the land of Canaan, to the cave of Machpelah, where his wife was actually buried there, if I remember correctly, and his forefathers. So that is the idea. Now, why is it that they embalmed him and that they did this? Well, it's important to know that these people knew if you didn't do this, there would be a bad smell. They would stink. And one of the ways that we know that, when we get to the Gospel of John, there's a story about a man called Lazarus that was dead and he came back to life. Do you remember the story? Well, in John chapter 11, verse 39, Jesus tells him, he says, "Take away the stone." And there's a response. They say, "But Lord," Martha says, she's the sister of the man who died, he said, "By this time, there will be a bad odor, a bad smell, because he's been in there for 4 days." So they knew that when someone died, they began to smell badly very soon. So I think that embalming and mummifying Jacob, it was probably as much of a practical thing as anything else. So this whole idea of a mummy, what is it exactly? Well, it's a body basically that has died, and they try to preserve the soft tissues, the skin, muscles, organs, all these things after they're dead. When they're alive, our bodies naturally fight off bacteria and fungus and stuff like this, but after death, those things will just cause our bodies to break down. It's kind of gross, right? So the whole idea of the mummifying process helps to fight against those bacteria and things like this. So natural, what we would call mummies, are actually a result of things drying out very quickly, or maybe they were frozen or they were buried in sand that was very hot, and it kills these bacteria. And so we also have this embalming process that would preserve the body. So I'm going to put a good kid-friendly link if you're interested to find a little bit more out about the whole mummification process. Kind of interesting. It'll be in the description. You can go there, and it explains things with some, like I said, kid-friendly type drawings. So this whole process of embalming, apparently it started in Egypt around 2700 BC, before Jesus. Before that time, they would just bury bodies in hot sand, and that would dry them out and preserve them naturally. And the Egyptians noticed this whole preservation process and assumed that, as a result, the bodies were needed after death. And so they believed that in order for a person's soul to live on, which is what we've been talking about, it must have a body left here on earth. That's why they invented this whole mummification process. And therefore, they also thought that they would need to take things that they might need in the afterlife that they used in their regular life once they were gone. So they would put food or clothes or furniture, toys, weapons, things like this with them. It's kind of interesting, all the extent that they would go to. You've probably seen that pyramids. Many times these wealthy people were buried in the pyramids, and they had all kinds of stuff in there with them. And that's where you've probably heard of like King Tut, these kinds of things. Those are good examples of that. Now, to help explain and understand this process is something that you can do. You need to be careful if you get to do this, but something you can do in your house is actually to mummify an apple. So I want you to watch this because I am going to mummify an apple. Check this out. Now, we've been talking about how Egyptians believed in this whole mummification process, and that just is the drying out of something to preserve that external body. So we're going to do a little bit of an experiment, and if you want to do this, you're welcome to. You're going to need at least one apple, a bunch of salt, and baking soda. And for this part, you probably need your parents' help. You're going to need a sharp knife, and I've actually got an X-Acto knife. Again, be careful. You're going to need your parents' help if you're going to do this. Maybe even plastic knives or something like that, because we're going to mummify an apple. So the first thing that we will need to do is peel all the skin off of the apple so that we can expose it to the salt and baking soda, which I'll explain once we get to that step. So I'm going to peel this apple, and then I'll tell you what to do next. So if you're super skilled, you can peel it in one long curly strip. I'm not quite that good. But I did it, I think, in 3 strips. Nevertheless, it is now peeled. So what we've got to do is we're going to core it. If you have an apple core, you can poke that through, but I don't, so I'm going to have to do it sort of the hard way. I'm going to use my knife, and I'm going to get the middle out of the apple, and then once again, I'll show you what to do next. So the way I did it, just poked my knife through from either side along the middle of that apple core, and then the apple core came out. So, at this point, you can decide what you want to do next. I am going to get my X-Acto knife. I'm going to kind of carve a little face into it, just so that we can see what it looks like today. I'm going to carve this face, then we're going to put it into this salt and baking soda solution. Then we're going to actually look at it after a week, and we'll kind of see what changed, how does it look. So, let me carve a face on here. And again, if you do this at home, be very careful. Maybe use a plastic knife, but definitely get your parents to help you with this. Looks kind of like a face. So we've got our apple face, mummy kind of a thing cut out. So what we're going to do now, set this aside, and we've got to make, it's called a Natron Mixture. It's 2 parts salt, 1 part baking soda. So what I've got here is 1 cup, and I'm going to fill this up. And while I'm filling that up, think about, if you're in math class, how much is half of 1 cup. So 2 parts to 1 part. How much is half of 1? It's actually easy math if you think about it. It's half. So we're going to have 1 cup of salt, and we're going to have half a cup of baking soda. It's a lot of salt, a lot of baking soda. And baking soda. Now that those are in there, we're going to just stir it up. Make sure that the salt and the baking soda are mixed thoroughly together. Okay. Then you're going to need a container. This is what we had handy. If you're going to do this at home, or if you have a smaller apple, you might be able to use a mason jar, but my apple wouldn't fit inside of a mason jar, so this is what we had. Obviously, the bigger container that you have, the more of this salt and the Natron mixture, the salt and baking soda you'll need. So I'm going to put a little bit of this in first so that I can set my mummy on top. And then we're just going to try to bury this thing in salt and baking soda. And if I don't have enough, I'm going to mix up some more. So we need to make sure it gets in the middle and then covers the whole of the apple. Okay. So that means I probably need twice as much as what I made. So I'm going to mix up another cup of salt and a half cup of baking soda. Okay, second batch mixed up. And again, 1 cup salt, half a cup baking soda. I about killed my salt container. So let's see if this is enough. I hope it is. Man, that's close. So now we're going to cover this just so that nothing else gets in it. We're going to let this sit there for a whole week. So let's see what happens. I'm excited to see, but we have to wait. So let's see what happens in 7 days. It has been 6 days. You're supposed to let it go for 7, but I started on Thursday. So I don't really know what to expect. But let us unearth, if you will, my mummy apple and see what it looks like. It smells interesting. Whoa. Whoa. All right. It feels squishy. Interesting. But look, you can still see my little face that I carved on it. Interesting. I don't know about you, but I've left apples and stuff like this out just for maybe overnight before I threw it away or something, just the core, and it was gross, way grosser than this, which is interesting. So I'm going to call this a success. So this is my apple mummy. So the Egyptians, they really thought that they needed their physical bodies well preserved to be able to go into that afterlife. So this really looks pretty similar to when it started and it was just raw. I mean, it's turned brown. But other than that, it really looks almost the same as when we started with this process, which is kind of neat. So you can do that, and if you do, maybe you should take pictures and put it in the comments. That'll probably take a week or so. So they really thought that they needed their physical body and all these things in the afterlife. And we know that in Scripture we're taught basically that that's not important. But how do we know that? I mean, we know that the Egyptians believed those things, but how do we know in Scripture that we don't? Well, fortunately, there's a couple of passages. We're just going to look at one. This comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 5. There's a little bit to read here, but I think it's very well worth reading. So 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 9 says, "For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed." What is this earthly tent? My physical body, that which you see, you can touch and feel, that is what we would call my earthly tent. "If it is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling. Because when we're clothed, we'll not be found naked. For while we are in this tent, this body, we groan in our burden because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal, things that can die, are called mortal. This body is mortal. It may not, so what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now the one who has fashioned us for this very purpose, he's made us for this purpose, is God, who has given us the Spirit as a deposit or a guarantee of what is to come. Therefore, we are always confident, and we know that as long as we are at home in this body, we are away from the Lord. For we live by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So we make it our goal to please Him, whether at home in the body or away from it. The idea being, this body that you see, one day it'll be gone. And what is mortal, this body, will be swallowed up by life. And God will make us a heavenly dwelling, a new body, that we won't have to worry about any of those things anymore. So we will live with Him in eternity. So while the Egyptians sought to preserve their physical body, it didn't really matter, because God is the one that is actually going to preserve for us a heavenly body. So I'm encouraged to know that God, through Jesus, has made a way for us to have life everlasting. We don't have to worry about the things on this earth, because we have the promise of life in heaven, where these bodies might be gone. He will give us a new, a heavenly, a glorious body that will be like His, like Jesus. And we'll live with Him for eternity. And I hope that you will make that decision someday to follow Jesus and also get the promise of life everlasting. Thanks for coming today. I hope that we'll see you next time.